The dog didn't move. He sat beside the bed like stone, ears flat, eyes fixed on the door. Every nurse who approached got the same low warning, not aggressive, not frantic, just certain. Like he knew something the rest of us didn't. I'd been unconscious for 3 days. I didn't know about any of it until later when someone showed me the footage from the hallway camera. 12 medical staff turned away, not by a locked door or a policy or a supervisor. By a 60-pound Belgian Malinois named Dax, who had dragged himself across 200 meters of Afghan hillside to stay beside me. And then she walked in. And Dax stood up, walked to her, and sat at her feet. Nobody in that ward could explain it. I'm still not sure I can either. People who haven't worked with a military dog don't understand what the relationship actually is. They think it's training. They think the dog performs because it was conditioned to perform and that the handler is just the person holding the leash. That's not wrong, exactly, but it's not the whole truth. Dax and I were paired 14 months before I was wounded. He was 3 years old. I was 31. The unit had worked with dogs before, but Dax was different in a way that was hard to articulate to anyone who asked. He was not excitable. He did not seek approval. When the other handlers ran drills, their dogs watched them constantly, checking in, waiting for signals, needing that feedback loop. Dax watched the environment. He watched everything except me because he didn't need to watch me. He already knew where I was. I grew up in a house where silence meant danger. My father was not a violent man, but he was an absent one, present in body, gone in every way that mattered. My mother worked 2 jobs and came home tired in a way that had nothing to do with ours. I learned early that people say one thing and mean another. That warmth is often transactional. That trust is a debt that will eventually be called in. I don't say this for sympathy. I say it because it explains why I was good at what I did and why I was bad at almost everything else. I had been married once. It lasted 2 years. She was kind and she tried, and I was deployed for 14 of those 24 months, and when I was home, I was not entirely home. That's the honest version. We ended it without anger, which almost made it worse. Anger would have meant something mattered enough to fight for. By the time Dax came into my life, I had stopped expecting consistency from people. Not bitterly, just factually. It was a data-based conclusion. People shift. People leave. People decide that the version of you they need is not the version you are. I had made peace with that. I had structured my life accordingly. Dax did not shift. On deployment, there is a version of intimacy that has nothing to do with affection and everything to do with proximity and survival. You sleep in the same space. You move through the same danger. You develop a language made of small signals, a change in posture, a pause, a direction of attention. With Dax, that language became the most fluent I had ever been with another living thing. He would stop before I heard anything. He would orient toward a doorway 20 seconds before a threat materialized. I stopped questioning it and started trusting it the way I trusted my own breath. The mission where I was wounded happened on a Tuesday. I know this because I have since looked at the date on the report. At the time, days of the week meant nothing. We had been in country for 11 weeks. We were not supposed to be where we were, not in a classified sense, but in a planning sense. We had been moved to that location 48 hours before based on intelligence that, I would later understand, was not what it was represented to be. I remember the hillside. I remember the sound. I remember Dax hitting my side and the impact of the ground, and then not much after that. I do not remember the 2 kilometers he reportedly covered to stay beside me while I was being extracted. I only know about it because 3 people told me independently, and because there is a brief mention of it in the after-action notes, a single line, almost an aside, as if the writer didn't know what to do with the information. Handler's dog remained with casualty throughout extraction. Dog sustained minor injury. Dog refused separation. That's the official record of it. 3 days later, I woke up in a military hospital in Germany to the sound of a low, steady exhale, and I turned my head and Dax was there, lying on the floor beside the bed, and I put my hand over the side of the mattress without thinking, and he put his head under my palm. I didn't feel lucky. I didn't feel grateful in any clean or cinematic way. I just felt, for the first time in a long time, that something in the world was exactly where it was supposed to be. The first week in the ward passed mostly in fragments. I would surface from sleep and there would be light, and then there would be dark, and I couldn't always tell how much time had moved between them. The pain was managed. I could feel its shape at the edges, the way you can feel the presence of something large in a dark room without being able to see it. They had calibrated the medication carefully enough that I was not suffering, but I was not entirely present either. I existed somewhere between. Dax was always there when I surfaced, always in the same place, floor beside the bed, oriented toward the door. I would watch him for a while before I did anything else. If he was calm, I was calm. If he wasn't, I paid attention. He was not always calm. In the second or third day, I couldn't be precise. I noticed that whenever the door opened, Dax would rise, not aggressively, not with teeth or sound in the early instances. Just up, positioning, a kind of quiet placement of himself between the bed and whoever had entered. The nurses seemed to have learned to move slowly. One of them, a woman with a gray braid and the practiced patience of someone who had been doing this for decades, told me that there had been some adjustment in the first days while I was unconscious. I asked her what she meant by adjustment. She said it had taken a while for the staff to understand what Dax would and wouldn't permit. I asked her what he hadn't permitted. She paused in the way that people pause when they're deciding how much to tell you. He kept people back, she said. Not dangerously, he just made it clear. I asked if anyone had been bitten. No, she said. He never got that far, people just stopped. I thought about that. Dax was not a protection dog in the traditional sense. He was trained for detection and patrol. The behavior she was describing, the quiet, sustained guarding, was not something you could train into an animal. It was something else. It was something that came from a different place than conditioning. Later that day, I noticed the folded paper. It was on the small table beside my water cup, just a piece of notepaper folded once. When I opened it, there were no words. There was a small drawing, a dog's paw print, roughly sketched with a date beneath it. The date was 2 years ago. I didn't recognize the date immediately. I set the paper down and looked at the ceiling and tried to locate the date in my memory, the way you try to locate a face you've seen before, searching backward through time for the context. I couldn't place it. Not yet. The smell was something I noticed that evening. Not unpleasant, nothing clinical or medicinal. Something faint and organic, like cold air, and something herbal I couldn't name. I thought at first I was imagining it. But it was there on the second night too, present when I woke at 2 a.m. and lay there listening to the ward sounds, the steady, distant beeping, the soft footfall of night staff, the particular silence of a building full of people trying to sleep. Dax was awake. He was facing the door, and his ears were forward, and his tail was still, but it was not the stillness of alertness. It was the stillness of recognition. I watched him for a long time. In the morning, when the gray braided nurse came in to check the charts, I asked her carefully if anything had changed in my care team recently. She said there was a new nurse on rotation. I asked when she'd started. 3 weeks ago, she said. Did she come on before or after I was transferred here? The nurse looked at me with the measured expression of someone who has learned not to react to questions from patients who are still technically recovering. She came on about 2 days after you arrived, she said. I nodded. I didn't say anything else. But I noticed that when the nurse left, Dax watched the door for a long time after it closed, not with tension, but with the particular focused attention he gave to things he was still deciding about. I trusted that attention more than I trusted most things. I asked for her name on the 4th day. The nurse I asked, a younger man named Tors, who had the efficient manner of someone who had learned quickly not to waste words in this environment, looked briefly uncertain, like he wasn't sure if he should answer. Then he said, Mara Ellison. The name meant nothing to me. She specifically requested this ward, Tors said, and then seemed to catch himself as if he hadn't meant to say it. I asked him what that meant, specifically requested. I don't really know the details, he said. I just know there was some back and forth with administration about the assignment. She came from a different post. He shrugged, the kind of shrug that communicates that a person knows more than they're saying but doesn't consider themselves authorized to say it. She's good, he added, which felt like a deflection. Dax likes her. Has he let anyone else close? I asked. Tors hesitated. Not the same way. I spent part of that afternoon thinking about what that meant. Not obsessively. I was still tired enough that sustained concentration was hard. But the question sat in me the way a small stone sits in a boot. Present, persistent, not quite painful but impossible to ignore. I first saw Mara clearly on the 5th day. She came in during the morning rounds, after the lead physician had been and gone. She moved with the economy of someone who had worked in environments where efficiency was not a professional preference but a survival requirement. She didn't introduce herself. She checked the IV line, looked at the chart, adjusted something on the monitor. She did all of this without looking at me directly, which I noticed because most medical staff make brief eye contact as a matter of professional courtesy. Dax, from the floor beside the bed, watched her. He did not rise. He did not orient defensively. He lay still and watched her with an expression, if a dog can be said to have an expression, of quiet familiarity. Like someone he had been expecting. She was about to leave when I said, "You requested this ward." She stopped, turned slightly, looked at me for the first time. "Yes," she said. "Why?" She was quiet for a moment, not evasive, more like she was deciding on the most accurate version of the answer. "I knew someone who had been on your unit," she said. "I wanted to make sure the care was right." It was not a satisfying answer. It was not intended to be. She left before I could frame another question. I noticed the tattoo when she had turned to go. It was on her inner left wrist, partially visible below the edge of her sleeve. Dark ink. Small text or numbers, I couldn't be certain from the distance. She had moved her sleeve down as she turned, not quickly, not nervously, but with the automatic gesture of someone who does it without thinking. I thought about that gesture for a long time afterward. Over the following 2 days, I watched her during the rounds she ran. She was precise. She interacted with other patients without the careful distance she maintained around me. She talked to the man 2 beds down, asked the older veteran near the window about his daughter. With me, she was present but contained. Professional in a way that felt like a deliberate choice rather than a default setting. And Dax watched her every time. On the 7th day, I asked Tors what post she had transferred from. He took slightly too long to answer. "I'm not sure," he said. "Somewhere overseas, I think." "I'd have to check." "Could you check?" He said he would, and he didn't, and I noted that too. I was beginning to understand that the information around Mara Ellison had edges that people seemed unwilling to approach. Not because she was threatening or inappropriate. By every observable metric, she was skilled and composed. But because something in her background, or her reason for being here, made the people around her choose their words with unusual care. Whatever she was not saying, and whatever they were not saying, Dax had already made his determination. I decided to trust the dog, and I decided to be patient because patience, the kind that does not perform itself, that simply waits without urgency, was the only tool I had left in a hospital bed with one functional arm and a body that was still making up its mind about the future. On the 8th day, the ward supervisor came to speak with me. Her name was Major Hendricks. She was in her mid-50s, with the upright bearing of someone who had never entirely left the military, even after transitioning to the medical corps. She was not unkind, but she was precise in the way that authority figures are precise when they have decided in advance how a conversation is going to end. She said she understood I had been asking questions about one of the nursing staff. I said that was accurate. She said she wanted to address any concerns I might have, and she settled into the chair by the bed with the deliberate ease of someone who is making it clear they are not in a hurry, and that I should understand this is a courtesy, not a necessity. "You're still in the early phase of recovery," she said. "That's not a criticism, it's clinical context. Medications like yours affect short-term memory formation and emotional processing. Things feel significant that aren't necessarily significant." I told her I understood that and that I wasn't making any accusations. "Of course not," she said, "but I want you to know that Nurse Ellison's assignment here went through standard channels. Her record is clean. She has a strong performance history, whatever you may have noticed." She paused on the word "noticed" in a way that was just precise enough to be intentional. "It doesn't reflect anything irregular." I asked about the specific request she had made to be assigned to this ward. Major Hendricks looked at me calmly. "Nurses request assignments for all kinds of reasons: familiarity with patient populations, skill matching, personal preference. None of that is unusual." I asked if she could tell me where Mara had been posted before this. "That's not information I'm going to share," she said. "Staffing records aren't patient information." She said it pleasantly. I asked about Dax. Something shifted in her expression just slightly. "What about him?" "He's been turning away staff for over a week," I said. "Medical-grade working dogs don't do that without reason. Someone should be asking why." "Animals behave strangely in medical environments," she said. "The smells, the sounds, the disruption to routine. Dax has been through significant stress, the injury, the transport, being separated from his normal environment. His behavior around one nurse over another doesn't mean anything clinical." She said it smoothly. And she believed it, I think, or had decided to believe it, which is a different thing but functions identically in practice. After she left, I lay for a while and let the conversation settle. The thing about being told you're reading too much into something is that it contains a kernel of real possibility. I was medicated. I was injured. I had spent weeks in conditions designed to produce hypervigilance, and hypervigilance, left without an appropriate target, turns itself toward whatever is available. I knew this. I had read the literature. I had sat across from enough post-deployment counselors to understand the mechanisms. But Dax was not medicated. Dax had not sat across from counselors. Dax did not have a psychological history that could be used to reframe his behavior as symptom rather than signal. Dax had a record of accurate environmental reads that I trusted with my life, not metaphorically, but literally in operational contexts where the cost of error was final. He had let her in. He had not let in anyone else. And when she moved through the ward, he tracked her not with the edged attention of wariness, but with something slower and more settled, the way he tracked sounds in a cleared building. Not danger. Presence. I thought about the folded note with the paw print and the date I couldn't yet place. I thought about the tattoo on her inner wrist. I thought about Tor's hesitation when I asked where she'd come from. I thought about Major Hendrix's particular careful smoothness, the way she had answered each question without actually answering it. None of this was evidence of anything. I knew that. I was not interested in manufacturing a crisis that didn't exist. I was not interested in the drama of accusation. But I was very interested in the truth. I had always been more interested in the truth than in peace, which had cost me in various ways throughout my life, and which I had never been able to change about myself, and which I had long since stopped trying to change. I reached down from the bed and found Dax's head in the dark. He was awake, ears up, facing the door. I left my hand there for a while and neither of us moved. Rays came on the 10th day. He was not technically supposed to be there. I wasn't at the formal visitor stage yet. But Rays had a way of moving through bureaucratic barriers that had never entirely made sense to me, and which I had stopped questioning years ago. He appeared in the doorway at around 11 in the morning with 2 cups of bad coffee and the expression he wore when he was carrying something heavy and deciding how to set it down. We had served together for 6 years. We did not need to perform ease with each other. He sat down, handed me a cup, and looked at Dax. "He looks good," he said. "He's been running security," I said. Rays nodded like this was not surprising. He drank his coffee. Outside, somewhere down the corridor, there was the soft sound of a cart being wheeled, footsteps, a door. "I heard you've been asking about one of the nurses," he said. I looked at him. "Already?" "Small ward," he said, not defensively, just factually. I asked him what he'd heard. "Just that you were asking." "And that Hendrix paid you a visit." He turned the cup in his hands. "What's her name?" "Mara Ellison." He went still. Not dramatically, Rays was not a dramatic person, but there was a quality of suspension in him, the way water goes still before it freezes. He was looking at the middle distance, and I watched him locate something in his memory, pull it forward, look at it. "Show me," he said. I didn't have a photograph. But I described her height, build, the movement economy, the contained quality of her, the tattoo on her inner left wrist. Rays put his cup down. "She was embedded with us," he said. "Combat medic 2 years ago, just before the Kandahar rotation. She came on about 3 months in, good, very good." He paused. "She was there for the compound night." I felt something rearrange itself in my chest. "What compound night?" He looked at me carefully. "You weren't briefed on what happened after extraction." "I was unconscious for 3 days," I said. "And then the debrief was—" I stopped. Because the debrief, now that I was thinking about it, had been unusually brief, unusually narrow. I had been told I was still medically fragile, that a full accounting would come later, and later had never fully arrived. "She was reassigned 48 hours after," Rays said. "I never got a clear reason." The co said it was rotation scheduling, but he shook his head. "It didn't feel like rotation scheduling. She was there one day and then she wasn't, and nobody wanted to talk about why." I asked if he had tried to find out. "Once," he said. "I was told it was an administrative matter and to focus on mission prep." He said it without bitterness, but with the particular flatness of someone who had learned that some questions produce responses designed to make you stop asking. I told him about the folded note, the paw print, the date. He was quiet for a moment. "What date?" I told him. He looked at the wall. I watched him run through something internally, a timeline, a sequence. "That's the date Dax was injured," he said. "Not on the hillside with you, earlier. That first incident, that ambush near the valley crossing when we had to break contact. Dax took shrapnel. You don't remember. I didn't remember. Or I remembered it imprecisely. It had felt minor at the time, the kind of incident that gets absorbed into the larger texture of a deployment. She was the one who treated him, Reyes said. I watched her do it. She worked on him for 40 minutes in a half-collapsed building with her headlamp flickering. He paused. Dax wouldn't let anyone near him either, except her. I looked at Dax. He was watching the door. She came here for him, I said. It was not quite a question. Sounds like it, Reyes said. We sat with that for a while. The corridor sounds continued. Someone laughed briefly somewhere distant, and the sound felt strange and unrelated, like a radio playing in another building. Reyes, I said. The mission where I went down, the intelligence that placed us there, did anyone ever formally review it? He picked up his coffee cup again, put it down without drinking. There was an internal review, he said carefully. I don't know what it found. I was never told. Were you asked to contribute to it? No, he said. That was the answer I had been both expecting and dreading. You learn in this work that the absence of a question is sometimes more informative than any answer. I had not been debriefed properly. Reyes had not been consulted. A medic who had been present at a critical moment had been quietly moved. None of it proved anything, but all of it meant something. She came in that evening during the late rounds. The ward was quieter at that hour. The daytime energy settled into something more subdued, monitors humming, the particular low light of medical institutions at night. I had positioned myself to be clearly awake when she arrived, sitting up slightly, and when she came through the door I spoke before she reached the chart. I know you were embedded with us, I said. I know you were there for the compound rotation, and I know you were reassigned 48 hours after. She stopped. She did not look surprised. She looked instead like someone who has been waiting at a particular door for a long time and has finally heard a knock. She set down what she was carrying, pulled the chair to a position slightly closer to the bed than medical convention required. Sat down. How much do you know? She said. Not enough, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Dax had risen from his spot on the floor and moved to sit beside her chair, not pressed against it, but adjacent. She reached down without looking and rested one hand briefly on his head, and he leaned slightly into it, and I watched that exchange and understood something about the nature of what I was in the middle of. I didn't come here for the assignment, she said. You already know that. She looked at Dax. When I was reassigned, I lost track of the unit. That's how it works. You go somewhere else, the information flow cuts off. You're not entitled to follow up. I spent about 6 months not knowing what had happened to anyone. Then I started asking. She paused, carefully. What did you find? Dax first, she said. I found out where he'd been transferred. I found out who his handler was. I found out you'd been wounded. She said it plainly, without softness. Critically was the word in the report I eventually found. There was a period of a few days where the prognosis wasn't. She stopped, started again. I put in for this post 3 weeks after I found out. It took 2 months to get approved. I asked her what they thought her reason was. Skill matching, she said. I listed a specialization in post-operative trauma management for returning operators, which is accurate. I do have that, but that wasn't why. You came for Dax. She held my gaze. Yes. And then? She was quiet again, longer this time. I found some things when I got here, in the records. In what I could access and what I couldn't access, and what the shape of the inaccessibility suggested. She moved her hands in her lap carefully. I'd already known something was wrong from the reassignment, the speed of it, the fact that I wasn't given a reason. You don't pull a combat medic 48 hours post-incident without a reason, not when you're already understaffed. But the reason isn't always one you can say out loud. I asked her what the reason was. I saw something in the mission file before I was pulled, she said. I saw the intelligence report that positioned your team at that location, and I saw an earlier version of that report, the original before it was amended. The room was very quiet. They were different, she said. The original report assessed the location as high risk with insufficient confirmation of target presence. The amended version, the one that went up the chain and generated the mission order, removed that assessment. Changed the confidence rating. The location was the same. The risk language was gone. I did not say anything. I don't know who changed it, she said. I have a name. I have the name attached to the amended version, but I don't know if that person made the change independently or was directed to make it by someone further up. I've been living with this for 2 years. Her voice was controlled, but I could hear the weight under it. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know who to trust. I still don't entirely, but I couldn't just. She stopped. You couldn't just keep it, I said. No, she said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, unlocked it, held it toward me, a photograph of a document. I looked at it without taking the phone, text, numbers. A header I recognized as the format for field intelligence assessments, a date. Then she pulled her sleeve back. The tattoo on her inner left wrist was not a paw print that was on the note. This was coordinates. Small, precise numerals arranged in 2 lines, latitude and longitude. I looked at them and I didn't need to verify them against a map. I knew those coordinates the way I knew my own name. I had been at those coordinates. I had gone down at those coordinates. So you wouldn't forget, I said. So I wouldn't let myself forget, she said. There was a difference, and she meant the difference. Dax put his head on her knee. I looked at the ceiling. I thought about the hillside. I thought about the amended report. I thought about the weeks of recovery and the narrow debrief, and the sense I had carried without articulating, a low, persistent frequency beneath everything, that the story I had been told about my own injury was not the complete story. "What do you need from me?" I said. She told me. That night was the longest of the recovery. I did not sleep. Not because of pain. The pain had receded to its managed distance, but because certain kinds of understanding, once they arrive, cannot be set aside for rest. They require you to remain present for them, to sit with them until they have finished doing what they do. The mission had not been random. That was the fact that I kept returning to, circling around, testing from different angles to see if there was a version of it that didn't hold. The location had been chosen based on a document that had been deliberately altered. Someone with access to that document had removed the language that would have generated scrutiny, that might have delayed or canceled the operation. Someone had decided that the risk assessment language was inconvenient. I thought about my team, not in an abstract sense, in the specific sense. I thought about the particular faces and voices of the people who had been with me on that hillside. Some of them had come home with wounds. One had not come home at all. I had stood in a cold field in Virginia and watched a flag being folded and handed to a woman who had been waiting for her husband to come back, and who would spend the rest of her life being told that her husband had died serving his country, which was true, but which was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that he had been placed in that situation by a document that someone had altered. The whole truth was that someone had made a calculation, and we had been inside the calculation, and we had not known. I lay in the dark, and I felt the specific quality of that knowledge, not rage, not grief exactly, but something that sits beneath both of those things. A kind of bedrock recognition that requires you to revise your understanding of the past. Everything I had thought about that mission, the operational context, the intelligence picture, the sense that we had been caught by bad luck in a genuinely dangerous environment, had to be re-examined in light of what Mara had seen. Bad luck had been manufactured. I thought about Dax. I thought about him dragging himself across that hillside. I thought about the after-action note, dog refused separation. He had not known what had placed us there. He had only known that I was there, and that he would not leave. That thought broke something loose in me. Not dramatically, I was not a person given to dramatic breaks, but quietly, in the way that something you have been holding at a careful distance finally comes close enough to touch. I had spent years structuring my life around the expectation that loyalty was transactional and temporary. I had arranged myself accordingly, compact, self-sufficient, not expecting to be stayed for. And then there was the single line in the report. Dog refused separation. No calculation, no assessment of cost, just refusal. And then there was Mara, who had spent 2 years carrying coordinates tattooed into her skin, who had pulled strings and changed postings and come to a military hospital in Germany not for her career or her record, but for a dog and a truth she couldn't put down. I thought about what it costs a person to carry something like that alone. The weight of knowing something that the people around you don't know, or won't ask about, or have decided not to look at. The specific loneliness of possessing a truth that the world hasn't finished with yet. I had thought of myself, over the years, as someone who understood loneliness. I had been thorough about it. I had built a life that accounted for it. But lying there in the dark, I understood that there were forms of it I hadn't yet encountered, and that Mara had been living inside one of them for 2 years. At around 3 a.m, I reached down and found Dax. He was awake, as he always was at that hour. I put my hand on his side and felt the slow, rhythmic expansion of his breathing, the warmth of him, the absolute steadiness. He did not move. He did not ask anything of me. I thought about the man who had not come home. I thought about the flag. I thought about the amended report. I thought about what it meant to be part of a system that is supposed to be trustworthy, and to discover that the system had, in a specific critical instance, not been what it represented itself to be. Not everywhere. Not always. But here, in this specific place, in this specific document, in the decision someone had made to remove 7 words from a risk assessment, here, the system had failed. And people had gone into that failure without knowing it. I did not want retribution. I want to be clear about that. I have thought about my own motivations carefully in the time since, and I do not believe retribution was what I was after. What I wanted was for the record to be accurate, for the story that existed in the files to match the story that had actually happened, for the woman with the folded flag to have access, someday, to the truth. That felt, lying in the dark with my hand on Dax's side, like the only thing that mattered. What followed was not dramatic. I want to be precise about that because there is a version of this story that wants to become something louder, a confrontation, a reckoning, a scene with raised voices and consequences that arrive in a satisfying rush. That is not what happened. What happened was quieter, slower, and in some ways harder to watch than a confrontation would have been. Mara had not come to me without preparation. In the 2 years she had spent carrying the information, she had also been, carefully, incrementally, documenting it. Not in a way that would expose her prematurely, but in the way that someone does when they understand that the only protection against a truth being buried is to make enough copies of it in enough places that burial becomes logistically difficult. She had contemporaneous notes from the day she saw the original and amended documents. She had a log of her reassignment, the timing, the stated reason, the absence of a real reason. She had the name attached to the amended report, which she had recorded in a personal journal within 24 hours of being pulled from the unit. She had, in short, been a better keeper of the record than anyone had been of her. What I provided was simpler. I provided my own account, my experience of the debrief, its narrowness, its brevity, the sense that I had not been told the full picture. My experience of learning, 2 years after the fact, that the intelligence placing my team at that location had been altered. I wrote it down in the way that I was asked to write it down, in the format required, and I signed it. A formal request for review went through JAG, the Judge Advocate General's Corps. It was not filed as an accusation. It was filed as a request for records review and an inquiry into the handling of a specific pre-mission intelligence document. That distinction mattered. An accusation puts people into defensive positions immediately. A records request takes longer and moves differently, more quietly, through systems that are less easily mobilized against it. I do not know the full details of what the inquiry found. I was not entitled to those details, and I did not receive them. What I saw were the effects. The officer whose name was attached to the amended report was reassigned to a non-operational administrative post about 6 weeks after the inquiry began. It was announced as a routine rotation. It may have been, but it happened at a specific time, and I noted the timing, and I did not need to know the internal reasoning to understand that the timing was not coincidental. The after-action file for the mission was formally reviewed and updated. I know this because I was contacted and asked to verify certain factual elements of the original record. The review was conducted quietly, by people I did not meet in person. I answered their questions by written correspondence. There was no announcement. There was no ceremony. The people who needed to know that the record had been corrected would know it. The people who did not need to know would not notice anything had changed. I thought often about the woman with the flag. I do not know if she was ever contacted. I do not know what, if anything, she was told. I hope she was told something true. I cannot confirm it. That absence of confirmation is something I have had to accept as part of how these things work. You put something into motion, and you can see the motion, but you cannot always see where it settles. Mara continued her rounds throughout this period. She was in the ward exactly what she appeared to be: skilled, precise, contained. She did not tell me about developments as they occurred. When I asked, occasionally, she would answer only what she knew and no more. She was not dramatic about what was happening. She had spent 2 years waiting for it to happen, and now that it was, she seemed above all things tired. Not broken, not relieved exactly. Just tired in the way that people are tired when they have been holding something very heavy for a very long time and have finally been able to set it down, and their arms are still remembering the weight. Dax, through all of it, remained. He sat beside the bed. He watched the door. He breathed steadily in the dark. He had known, somehow, before any of us had worked it out, that something important was present in this room. I have stopped being surprised by that. They discharged me on a Tuesday in March. The paperwork took most of the morning. There were forms about medication and follow-up appointments and physical therapy schedules and emergency contacts. There was a brief conversation with Major Hendricks, who was professional and appropriate and did not mention our earlier conversation. I did not mention it either. Dax's retirement and transfer had been formalized 2 weeks prior. The process had required several signatures and a veterinary assessment, and a form I had not known existed specifically for the retirement of military working dogs. He now belonged, officially, to me, which felt like a strange formality for something that had already been true for a long time. Mara was not there when I left. She had told me the evening before that she had put in for reassignment. Another post, she said, somewhere with fewer complications. She said it without asking for anything from me, and I did not ask where she was going, because it seemed like the right kind of privacy to allow her. I sat outside the hospital on the last morning. The air was cold and clear and smelled like the particular cleanliness of early spring in Northern Europe. Dax sat beside me. I did not feel victorious. I want to be precise about that. I felt the weight of everything that had happened, not as burden but as presence. The weight of the man who had not come home, and the flag, and the amended document. The weight of 2 years that Mara had spent alone with something she couldn't put down. The weight of Dax on a hillside, refusing to move. Truth, when it finally arrives in the right place, does not always make a sound. It moves through systems quietly, corrects records, shifts personnel, changes files in ways that most people will never see. The world does not visibly rearrange itself around it, but the record exists now. Somewhere in a file in the correct version of the document, the true shape of what happened is written down. That is not everything, but it is not nothing. Dax leaned against my leg. We sat there for a while and watched the light move.